What if you could capture the essence of fall in a piece of jewelry? Today I'll show you how to do just that, blending natural autumn elements with your own artistic touch. Hey there, Sandy here with another creative tutorial at keepsakecrafts.net. Before we mix up any resin, let's talk about materials and planning. Your imagination is the only limit here. We'll be using a variety of inclusions such as papers like old book pages, dictionary paper, mulberry paper, even scrapbooking paper, dried flowers, leaves, powders, and more. You can even add personal touches like sculpted polymer clay pieces or metal charms. But first, let's plan our composition. The basics for resin jewelry are 1. Something to hold the resin, like a mold or a bezel. 2. A backing if you want one, like torn dictionary paper or a bit of a paper napkin. Then your focal elements and accents for extra texture and detail. Here I'm using torn dictionary paper for a vintage look, paired with some dried flowers, and maybe even a clear sticker. But you could change that up for something else, like maybe these little sculpted mushrooms, which I'll show you how to make in a minute. Dried leaves add a nice touch behind everything, as do paper or dried flowers. Take your time with this step. Arrange and rearrange until you're happy with the composition. Contrast is key. For example, on this piece, I layered gold flakes in the back, but then I layered this light colored leaf. You can hardly see it. It blends right in. The resulting look is kind of muddy. One thing you can do to add some contrast that doesn't help this piece too much, but might help another, is to add a black backing. More on that in a minute. For this one, there is room for some more resin, so I may cut out a couple of the leaves from this green sticker and add them, and then maybe add another flower over it and have a bit more contrast to the piece. You could also maybe add a charm and pretend that that leaf was supposed to blend in. If you want your background layers to blend, then low contrast. If you want things to pop, then high contrast. I used this bit of a paper napkin. I wasn't sure how translucent it would get, how much it would show in the resin, but it shows up pretty nicely. But I'm going to have to use like dark colored things or something with a lot of contrast in order for it to show up. So be thinking about that as you do your layers, that some things will just get lost and really not look very nice in the end. For a lot of nice pop and contrast, I added black resin dye to some of my resin and then poured it into these bezels. When you top them with the bright autumn colors and a bit of greenery, they really pop. You get a totally different look with a clear resin in there. Once you're satisfied, snap a photo with your phone to save the layout for later. Here's a cool trick for determining how much resin to mix up. Simply pour water into your mold and then pour it out into a cup with a measure on it. If you're using a 2-part epoxy resin, you'll need half of this much resin and half as much of the hardener. But if you're doing your pieces in layers, you should probably cut that amount in half again. And it's best if you have a few other molds on hand to work on so you can use up all of your resin that you mixed. Before pouring any resin, make sure your silicone molds are dry and clean. If you're using open back bezels, press them onto packing tape, sticky side up, that's attached to a tile. This will hold the resin in place as it cures. If you can't find dried flowers in the colors you want, you can color them with alcohol inks. A drop is all you need for tiny flowers, and adding a bit of alcohol blending solution will help the colors spread beautifully. If you add too much ink, you end up with colors that are too dark. Do be sure to let these dry completely before you use them in your resin project. These hydrangeas were from my garden and they have lost all of their color. So a bit of orange and yellow alcohol ink perks them right up. This package of off-white paper flowers is from the craft store, and they can be colored in the same way to suit any season. Metal charms from the craft store add a nice touch of whimsy and dimension to your pieces. If they have a hanging loop, you'll first want to use wire cutters to trim away the loop, then use a file to file away any oddly shaped or rough edges. After that, they can be customized with alcohol inks or vintage patinas to match your color palette. Sculpting polymer clay mushrooms is super easy. First, roll thin off-white logs for the stems, cut pieces, and give them a little bit of shape with your fingers. Then roll small balls for the caps, make various sizes, and press into one side with a ball tool of a proportionate size to create the underside of the cap. Use pastel powders to give them an autumn look before baking. Once baked, dip the stems into a tiny dab of super glue and put it into the cap of your choosing, and then they'll be ready to embed in your resin. It can be difficult to find dried flowers that are tiny enough to fit into jewelry. One easy shortcut is to use clear stickers from the craft store. Just trim away the motif you need, no need to even peel away the backing. The clear plastic will disappear in the resin. I'm planning to use clear stickers to make this bookmark. I didn't even cut the stickers out of the sheet, just cut a strip right off. And of course, these techniques work for any season. Here's a sheet of Christmas stickers, and I made this really pretty bookmark. Wouldn't this be a lovely gift or a stocking stuffer? Once you have your composition planned and all your parts and pieces are ready, now it's time to mix up your resin. Follow the manufacturer's instructions carefully. I have a 2-part resin which mixes equal parts of the resin and the hardener. Resin can be hazardous, so be very careful. Work in a well-ventilated area and wear gloves. I recommend working in small batches of about 20 to 30 milliliters at a time, especially if your resin has a shorter working time. Just work slow and steady. Here I am mixing this for a full 3 minutes, and after that 3 minutes is up, I'm going to let it sit for about 5 minutes, just so some of the bubbles will come to the surface. Make sure when you're mixing to keep scraping the bottom and the sides and try to get everything as evenly incorporated as possible. Now for the fun part, embedding your pieces. I like to pour a base layer of resin, then start adding my elements. You want to work in layers to keep your design in place. Start with the background and move to the foreground. So I'm adding this book page first, and then some leaves, and then the polymer clay mushrooms. I'm leaving a little bit of space at the base of the mushrooms for some moss. I'm saving the dragonfly charm for another layer as I want it to float on top. My mushroom rolled over so the top of the cap got resin on it and got shiny, and that's okay. If you can keep it under control and leave that kind of powdery edge, I like that better. So I'm going to let this layer cure right here, and then I will add more later, and that way we can build it up and really get lots of interesting layers in our design. So the gold flakes and the charm and the moss will come later. Curious about what goes on behind the scenes? My patrons get an inside look at my creative process, sneak peeks of upcoming projects, and more. Your support on Patreon helps me keep making these videos, and I would love it if you joined in on the fun. And for those of you who are already patrons, thank you, thank you, thank you. You're wonderful, and I love you all. If you see any bubbles, air bubbles in your resin, you can just run a lighter, and running it quickly over the polymer won't burn it. If you hold the lighter on the polymer clay, it's going to scorch, but just run it quickly. Pop any bubbles, set this aside, and work on a piece that's further along. By the way, I poured my resin into a little silicone cup from the larger cup. It's just easier to manage, and I find it makes a little bit less of the mess. Also, if you pour in a thin stream from the cup, that will help pop a lot of your bubbles. Here's the one I showed you earlier that I wasn't really thrilled with because of the lack of contrast. I'm actually going to pop it back in the mold. Not that I have to, but it kind of helps keep it contained. And let's deal with that lack of contrast. I've got some green leaves that pop nicely and a little mushroom here. So we'll just add a pretty thin layer. And I use my tool. I have a pair of tweezers. You could use an awl. I'm going to scooch this resin right to the edge. You do want to start pouring usually in the center, especially your upper layers, and then kind of push it out to the edge. And sometimes I might want these flowers to be exposed. I really like that texture. But in this case, they look rather nice. The colors really pop with the resin surrounding them. And there might be an extra lip of resin on the edge, kind of like on this piece. I don't know if you can see it on camera. It's got a little bit of an edge, but we can sand that away once it's completely cured. So now I've got my green leaves, and I'm going to put it right over where that sticker is that kind of blends in too much. And I do want to embed this because these are delicate, and if they're not embedded, they will get broken off. So you just kind of gently poke at it. I don't want to add too much resin. You can sometimes dip things like this in the resin before you add them, and that may help prevent trapping air bubbles and help it mesh a little better in the resin. See, suddenly now we have some contrast. And you can kind of look at it from different angles and see if it's not smooth. I may need just a tad bit more resin, but let me add my mushroom first, because remember, every element you add is going to displace another. So I'm going to add my little mushroom. Let's see if we can keep that positioned where I want it. There we go. And I think I just want another drop of resin right up here on the leaf. There we go. Get it kind of smoothed out and domed. Get that tucked in. Now here's a quick tip for you. If you're going to run your lighter over your piece to pop bubbles, that's great. Do it before you add your moss. I did it. I can't tell you how many times I did it and caught my moss on fire. How dumb. Just got in the zone and wasn't thinking clearly. So first pop bubbles. And now we'll add a little tiny bit of moss. And you probably need far less than you think. Just a little bit. I love it around the mushroom. It just adds some texture. And there, we'll let that one cure just as it is. Always a good idea to have a few extra molds lying around ready for you to tuck stickers and pieces in so that you can use up all of your resin in the time allotted. If you want to have a dark background like the black background in this piece, you can dye your resin with resin dyes. Do be very careful what you choose to dye your resin. These are made specifically for 2-part epoxy resin. And be careful to follow the directions. You can only put so much dye in it before it compromises and the integrity of the resin, and it won't ever cure. Then we can use that to fill in these little bezels. First, get rid of some of the bubbles if I can, right in the container. It's silicone, so the flame isn't going to hurt it. And I'm going to pour a very, very thin layer. I just want the background. So that will probably do it. And I will let this cure right in the bezel like this. And then once that's cured, I'll add my inclusions like the flower and the leaves in a layer of clear resin. Because if you add them now, you have a chance of the resin coming up and over and discoloring your inclusions. The key here is patience and just letting everything cure in layers so that you have them positioned exactly where you want. So in this one, I got a little impatient and I made this layer way too deep, and so this mushroom went off to the side on me, and it's not quite where I want it. You can also add tiny details like metal flakes or micro beads between layers for extra texture. And if you need a final smoothing layer, UV resin works great for this because it cures quickly under UV light. To finish your cured pieces into jewelry, for those in bezels with loops, you can add findings such as ear wires, maybe with a pretty bead in between, or add a jump ring and a chain for a necklace or a bracelet charm. To make the edges tidy, you can sand them by placing a piece of sandpaper on a flat surface and then rub the edges all around until they are evenly sanded. I like to finish these sanded edges with a deco color paint pen, but I'm sure there are other techniques out there that you can research. To add a hole for hanging, you can use a handheld drill bit. Be sure to start your hole with a dimple made with an awl. This will keep your drill bit exactly in the spot where you want the hole. Resin drills fairly easily. The hole in this piece only took me about a minute to make. And if you don't want to drill holes, you can always add a glue-on bail for a nice finish to jewelry. Be sure to let each layer cure fully before moving on to the next, and take your time with the process. Feeling inspired to create your own autumn jewelry? Drop a comment and tell me what elements you plan to include. And for more mixed media resin ideas, dive into my mixed media resin art video and keep the creativity flowing.